Welcome to our first lecture on biology, and we will explore the definition of life in this first chapter and the different attributes that are given to living objects. Whether it's bacteria or whether they're bats, whether we look at fungi, whether we look at trees, whether we compare a whale to a human, there's a immense diversity of living world that comes to mind. And with the concept of a big bang that happened millions and millions of years ago, the result of the big bang somehow changed our planet. And as the planet cooled, certain environments were more adaptable to certain organisms. So over a very long period, all forms of life have traced in this planet that we live on. But if we look at a definition of life, it's really almost impossible to define life in one simple statement. Usually, when we look at life, we are comparing with living objects versus non-living objects. So, for example, a non-living object would be a rock versus a living organism such as a bat or a tree. So if we compare rock to, let's say, a block of iron, we find that what they have in common is that they are both composed of certain elements. Now, the variation of the exact element may be different in different objects, whether they're living or non-living. So really, doesn't really define living organism. Living organisms also obey the same physical and chemical laws. For example, the law of gravity or the law of thermodynamics or the law of energy, conservation of mass. A lot of these different laws and theories are applicable to both. So, back again, we cannot define life by just one simple statement. Life is usually associated with many attributes that can be associated with it, and these different attributes will help define or distinguish living objects from non-living objects, and we will in a short while get to the details of those. The most basic or the fundamental unit of life is the cell. The cell is the building block of living objects. It is the smallest and simplest unit that is present. Now, there are organisms that are unicellular, which means that they are composed of just one cell. The unicellular organisms are very simple, and one of the examples are bacteria, and another example is a unicellular organism that belongs to protist, and it's called as paramecium. Usually when you get pond water, you can very easily see paramecium. However, bacteria is almost impossible to see even with a microscope unless you stain it and you use a more higher magnification of a microscope. Paramecium, on the other hand, are visible with just the pond water. These are unicellular organisms. Now, these unicellular organisms have evolved over time into multicellular species, and the multicellular species could be, for example, as the image shows over here, it can be a morel or a fungi or a sunflower or a geese that's shown in this image over here. So multicellular organisms are as the name implies, they're more composed of one cells, and they are much more organized than a simple unicellular organism. During this evolutionary process from the Big Bang to where we are today, there were extreme conditions, and the extreme conditions meant that Earlier, we had life that existed at very high temperatures, very different atmospheric component of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And as life evolved, a wide variety or wide diversity arose. So we have living objects that are micro, which means they're extremely small. Micro usually implies 10 to the power negative 6 millimeters, which would be a really small dimension to be seen by naked eye, to something really large that is more global. Each level of this organization, from micro to a larger image, for example, as you can see over here, this is the structure of an atom, and this is the structure of an atom, this is the molecule, this is our simplest cell, and if you can see up here, we've got the elephant, and then we have the world over here. So at each complex level, there is more complexity as evolution went on. For example, a population of an organism, as shown in this image over here, is going to be same species within a particular area. An organism is composed of either individual or complex individuals that contain the same organ systems. And then organisms are usually composed of organ systems, which are composed of several organs working together. So the list keeps on going down. You can see we start from an atom, molecule, cell, tissue. Cells of the similar kind will make tissues. Tissues will then, that are functioning similarly, will form the organs. Organs will then work with other organs to work in a more important system, which we call as the digestive, for example, digestive system. And then from an organ system, we have organism, then population, then community, then ecosystem, and then the biosphere. So this level of organization shows that from the building block, which is the element, elements are combining at each level to give you a more structured pathway. And finally, the earth that we live on is the ecosystem, and it's made up of this biosphere. So what are the basic requirements of living things? How do we, if you keep in your mind the rock versus a flower or a plant, living things cannot maintain their organization or carry on any of its life activity without an outside source of nutrient and energy. So this is an essential component, which is the first one. We must need materials and energy. Energy is later on, we'll get into it. Energy is defined as the capacity to do work. And let's just look at, let me just list you the three first. So we'll look at materials and energy. Living things also require to reproduce and develop, which means it needs to make a copy of itself to pass the information from one generation to another generation, and it also needs to develop from a fertilized egg to a larger complex organism. And thirdly, living organisms also adapt to the environment. By adaptation, we're talking about modification that will make the organism more suited to their way of life. So coming back to our first most important requirement, that is energy. Energy is the capacity to do work. The energy that is derived for all plant and all organisms is actually coming from the sun. So it's coming from the sun, which sun is the major source of energy, and through the process of photosynthesis, the solar energy is converted to the chemical energy of organic nutrient molecules, and in particular we'll spend a whole chapter discussing that later, and this is the molecule of glucose. And glucose then drives many reactions that we will study in a section called as metabolism, where we will see how glucose can be broken down to release energy, and also we will look at all the reactions that help build certain molecules that are definitely present in living cells. And the term homeostasis means that living objects or living organisms must maintain a state of biological balance. That is, that around the boundaries of an organism, there may be some extreme conditions of, for example, a change of temperature or the level of pH or the moisture or other physical factors. And living organisms have a range in which they can tolerate any of these changes. And within the system, there is an internal clock that monitors these conditions. And organisms have a very intricate feedback and control mechanism that does not require a lot of activity, but it triggers certain responses in our system to continue keeping that homeostasis or maintaining a state of biological balance. For example, if an organism or an animal or even us are hungry, there will be certain triggers that will be released which will force the individual to get up and get some meal. A lizard, for example, may raise its internal temperature by basking, by just sitting in the sun, or it can cool down by moving into the shade. So those are that's what homeostasis is about. And don't forget that living organisms must require energy, must require nutrients for food. So some organisms, we will learn later, can manufacture their own food. For example, photosynthetic bacteria and plants can manufacture their own food, while other animals will live on these organisms to gain their energy. So, and I think we'll in a little while look at some examples of the food web. For example, how you can see in a grassland, mice will feed on plants and then and seeds and so forth, and the snakes will actually feed on the mice. And when the snakes can be picked up by hawks, and the hawks can be fed by rabbits. And the snakes, for example. So this interaction just keeps on going to acquire your food. There are the three examples that are shown over here in this image. And the first one is actually a simple organism that is shown to absorb food. Sometimes certain organisms will ingest food, and some organisms will eat food depending on what's available to them, whether they're autotrophs or heterotrophs, which means whether they can synthesize their own food or they're depending on other organisms. Let's go on with more requirements of living things. Living things can detect a change in the environment. So which is mainly a response due to adaptation. For examples, a vulture can detect a dead meat from a mile away. The monarch butterfly can sense the temperature change as fall starts and will start migrating south. Certain microorganisms, certain bacteria will also follow the light or certain chemicals, and they will either drift towards it or move towards it. Even plants can follow the path. For example, if you have a plant in a pot in your home and you notice that over a time period the stems or the leaves are facing more towards the sunlight, and the plant looks almost lopsided, and the best way to do that is to keep on rotating your pot so it has a uniform growth. So these are responses that involve some sort of movement, and living organisms will respond to the movement and will respond to these environmental changes. These responses collectively are also called as a behavior of an organism. Behavior is a pattern that is observed by different organisms over a period of time.